All right, finally, adding another chapter to katana versus other types of swords and schools of swordsmanship. This also crosses over into my discussion of the Shin Gunto, and specifically a reply to at least one comment I got talking about the katana's superiority in the way it's carried and deployed as an EDC sidearm, which I absolutely agree with. Now, without going into trigger warning territory, when I carry a handgun, over the decades I've discovered my favorite means of everyday carry is usually some sort of inside the waistband or clamshell pancake sort of rig that keeps the weapon very close up against my body. Now, in certain situations that might make it a little bit harder to reach and draw, but it keeps it very secure, keeps it from moving around, and feeling where it is up against my body allows me to get to it and draw it quickly and consistently. And I think that may have been influenced by my history with katana versus, say, the Chinese swords I'm familiar with. Now, as I'm exploring HEMA, most European swords, when they're worn, are worn from hangers. This would also be true of many of the Chinese swords I worked with in my history. In the schools back then, you'd be talking about Qing and Ming Dynasty designs, so most of them are scabbards with hangers of one kind or another, versus some of the earlier designs that were worn through a belt, similar to a katana. Now, I never appreciated wearing these, and interestingly enough, the practice in the schools, the forms, if you're familiar with Chinese Dao and Zhen forms, they rarely ever start with the scabbard worn. Scabbard's usually somewhere else. And you start your practice with the sword usually in your offhand, either retracted behind the arm, or in the case of the Dao, cradled like this. So not much time spent practicing anything like sword drawing, for instance. We did a little bit, pragmatically speaking. Now, what you'll see here is me wearing one of my Shin Gunto reproductions from its hanger. There are certain advantages to wearing a sword from a hanger, just like wearing a sidearm, a firearm, maybe slung down on the hip. Your reach changes, and you're able to draw a longer sword more comfortably. Now, in another video, we'll talk about how tachi are worn and things like that. However, one of the things I found is this sacrifices for me some surety of carry, shall we say, and therefore also deployment. Interestingly enough, most Japanese officers wearing Shin Gunto, when they were actually in the field, forewent the hanger and slid the sword through their web belt, very much like a katana. Now, what you've seen I've done is I took a tassel off the lanyard loop, and I can use it as a Sageo if I choose to secure it. But now, having the weapon more up against the body allows me to not only move with it better without it flopping around and becoming a hazard, but I can feel it up against my body. So even when I don't have my hand on it, I can find it quickly for deployment. Let's take a look at how that works with a katana. But first we have to talk about Mike's dysfunctional relationship with Sageo. You'll notice that all the swords I reviewed and all the ones that are on display, Sageo are tied in presentation knots. Now, can I tie a presentation knot? Absolutely. Do I enjoy tying presentation knots? No. Now, if I am, well, shall we say dressing out, going to a dojo. Talked about this in Pragmatic versus Ritual Martial Arts. If I'm around people or in a situation that is favoring, appreciating, demanding, insisting on traditional ritual practices, I will certainly follow them. But just like other traditional ritual practices in my life in general, I've been known to forget entire major holidays unless I'm around people who are really into those ritual traditions. There have been more than one occasion where I have what I call the Ebenezer Scrooge moment, where I wake up, "Lad, what day is it? Christmas? Oh crap." Yes, I'm that bad at being a human being. Sageo. Many different schools, Ryuha, have different uses for Sageo, different ways that they're worn in practice in uniform. Now, if you actually look back through history and consider some of the other uses and the way Sageo are used, may not have that in common. I refer to a lot of drawings and even photographs of samurai that, they're not using the Ito or the Sageo the same way that you tend to see it in a lot of dojo. There's also some wisdom that the Sageo is kind of utility cord. You can use it to tie your sleeves back. Well, I'm not wearing any sleeves that need tying back. Or as an arresting rope for hojo jutsu, something else I've been trained in that maybe one day we'll get around to discussing. Or just in general, if you need a handy cord in the field. Okay. Now, one of the things I've mentioned in other videos is my training has changed. For about the last 2 decades, I haven't spent a lot of time in formal schools or gyms, which means my training is pretty much on my own. Also, with my busy lifestyle, while I can still devote, an hour or two here and there to hard training, my daily training is a routine of, catch that free 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. Anytime I've got the time to get up and move and practice any of my martial arts, including grabbing a sword. You'd be surprised why I keep them handy for that purpose. Now, that means I'm usually practicing in whatever I'm wearing, street clothes, usually also including shoes. If you're familiar with Japanese traditions and taking off your shoes, entering and then putting back on and exiting a building, home, dojo, if you're doing that regularly, you tend to wear shoes that are easy to get on and off. Well, my boots are not necessarily easy to get on and off, and if I've been wearing them all day, probably not pleasant to the people around me when I take them off. So most of my training is done in, some pretty heavy footwear. But then I figure, if I'm practicing for self-defense, probably going to be wearing shoes, unless you catch me relaxing in my own home. Probably going to have shoes on, and pants and a shirt and whatever. I do choose clothes in general that I feel comfortable moving in. Now, in the Edo period, when this weapon became an EDC carry weapon, not so much secured to the body for battle, where yes, it makes sense to deploy the Sageo and tie it into your obi very securely, but if you're in that routine of going in and out of buildings, constantly taking this sword on and off, tying it in. Some of the practices that you'll see again in the Ryuha that are in current existence, they kind of leave it looped in various loose ways. I don't like it. Also, when they display the sword with the thing just kind of hanging here, I guess I'm a little obsessive about having it snugly tied. And out of Mike's laziness, he's kind of discovered a few things that maybe you have, but if you are a stickler for ritual, you're probably going to find this kind of offensive. So hopefully it doesn't induce a stroke, but a couple of things. I have broken kuragata. If you have also had a sword that when you untie the Sageo, the shutadome come off, all right, well, that solves both of these problems. Your kuragata is protected and secured. I've also found this to be excellent protection for those moments when people have gotten sloppy, drawn a sword wrong, sharp edge comes through saya. It's an extra bit of protection. Now, is it secure? Depends on the kind of belt I'm wearing, but frankly, again, it's usually not an obi, like a kaku obi or something like that. It's usually a gun belt, frankly. So leather, web, something like that. Something that secures my weapons in general. I may even just shove it through my normal belt. It's heavy enough to do that. So, for when I'm wearing a sword for practicing drawing, which is not all the time, a lot of the styles of Kenjutsu I practiced, like that Chinese swordsmanship, the longer forms were practiced without the scabbard on. You might even be just using bokken, which don't have a scabbard. It is also not uncommon to see duelists, if they are preparing for a straight-up fight, go ahead and take the scabbard off and set it aside so it doesn't get in their way. It can be encumbering, so being able to remove a scabbard and set it aside, I appreciate that. Now, what does it change functionally? Well, one, it does create a wear that is about 1.5 inches higher in the belt than it would be if this was just resting on the kuragata and the tied in. However, for me, I like that. I like being able to have just that extra bit of room to grab it. Also, that presentation knot just fits into my hand just right. I find that spot very easily. This style of wear also allows me to do several things that I find very adaptive based on the different ways I've learned how to wear a sword. For instance, one of the things you'll see in common for different styles, they'll say that Iaido practitioners love to wear their sword this way, Kenjutsu practitioners love to wear it this way. Well, if you were an Edo period samurai walking around in public, you probably have your sword up this way so you didn't hit people with your scabbard. When you go to deploy it, shifting it to this position makes sense for the draw, but you should be able to draw it from the upright position. That shouldn't be a problem. You should be able to draw your sword from whatever position it's in if you need to draw it in an emergency. Same thing with whether you're wearing it back here on your hip or more across your center. It usually depends on what else you've got on in terms of gear, but this shifts freely. I also found that after I've drawn the sword, this extra bit of grip, I'm not as likely. I have actually lost scabbards through my obi and they wind up kind of semi-upside down if I've been doing a lot of techniques between drawing and sheathing. This seems to prevent it. A few other things to consider as things I've learned out of laziness. There are certain ryuha, for instance, that practice what I call the saya cheat. What is the saya cheat? Right? Seen that one before? Where you basically take the scabbard, extend it, and I've actually seen them sit there and hold it like this, like that's a normal thing to do when the person doesn't know what you're about to do. Yeah. But it could be a way to deploy your sword, especially into a parry in a hurry. This would also match the kind of draw you'd get if the scabbard was just simply, well, in your hand and not in your belt. So for me, it's just very useful. Another thing, by the way, other things I've learned to do with swords and different arts, if I happen to need that emergency parrying weapon, well, there it is, right? Nothing to entangle it. So yeah, I do not use Sageo appropriately, but it works for me. Again, if I'm actually dressed out in, the hakama and everything, I will behave differently as that particular school's ritual demands, but otherwise, in my general practice, yeah, you're going to see me like that. And it works for me. But, as I said, compared to a sword hanging from, well, some kind of frog or hanger, I just really like this because I'm also used to drawing it from any orientation. It could be completely upright. It could be in horizontal position, edge up. Not a problem. It could be, as many people do, with the scabbard turned to the side, right? Where you suddenly turn it to the side so you can draw into that cut. You can do that one. If I want to make an uppercut, I can suddenly flip it all the way over and do so. Now you'll notice every time when I put the sword away, when I do noto, yes, I do orient the blade edge up. And the scabbard is usually always in the exact same position. The other thing you're going to notice is, despite the fact I've described my arms as being really short, 28-inch blade, I don't really have to compensate by dragging the saya back behind me. If you look at it from this position, it stays put, and I've got plenty of clearance. Now, if I'm using an odachi, a longer sword, yeah, I'm probably going to need a little bit more recoil, but then I might do a little bit different with the Sageo. Speaking of those Edo period samurai and seeing them wearing a katana with the Sageo still in the presentation knot, it's usually not this even kind. Most of the loops are north of the kurigata, so that would allow it to sit a little bit deeper in the obi. But yeah, I think their own habits changed because they were used to, well, katana on, katana off, katana on, katana off. And I think we kind of stumbled upon the same solution without it being something that was specifically taught in the Ryuha that I studied. But the wear of the katana, how it feels, how it carries. And like I said, I spent a lot of time with this kind of sword. I can wear this sword for long, long periods, whereas again, a sword from a hanger gets unpleasant for me really quickly. So bonus, katana. Hope that was helpful, informative, and not terribly offensive, but share your thoughts, experiences, ideas in the comment section, and hope to see you again